Welcome, everyone. My name is Justin, your Believer Made Unbeliever podcast host.
I'm Kevin, the devout Christian presence on this Tiger and Lamb podcast.
A Christian Quisition production.
A few years ago, I used to be walking, down the street or something, and I would play this kind of hypothetical game. I would look at a car that was maybe driving slowly, and I thought, if for whatever odd reason I found myself in a position where somebody was persecuting me on behalf of my faith, would I be willing to be shoved in front of that car that was going 20 miles per hour? Another example would be, would I be willing to lose a finger because I was a Christian? Would I be willing to lose a hand? And these exercises kind of were like tests that I would do to myself to see how much do I really believe in this?
Yeah.
How much would I really be willing to lose? Because as a Christian in America, my life is very safe. And I don't actually have to confront any of those things.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. And I mean, it happened, as far as I know, very few times. I mean, Columbine was one example. There's a story of, the gunman asking, like, are you a Christian? That's like 1 in a million, literally. Like, that almost never happens. In more recent times, I've kind of changed my question to, what does hell feel like? And I'll give you an example. I like to put things in the oven.
Yeah.
And I'm very concerned about burning my hand when I take the thing out of the oven.
Yeah.
And I think about how painful that would be if I touched that oven in the wrong spot for a split second.
Yeah.
It would ruin my night. It would be a night, and it would be over, and the next morning I'd be like, have a cool story to tell. But that's for 1 second. And I thought about, how painful would it be if I sat in that oven for a minute? I mean, that would be the worst thing that ever happened in my life. And then I thought about, well, what if I was in there for a year? And then I think you know where I'm going with this. Hell is a long, 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 long time. In fact, it's forever in that oven.
And it's probably a lot worse than
Yeah.
the oven.
I was watching a movie recently, Midsummer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and very terrifying movie. Very well done. I was very moved by it in, dark ways. But at the end, spoiler alert, I'll give you a chance to pause. Basically, a guy gets burned alive in a bear suit.
Yeah.
And just hearing him even scream for a few seconds, again, it got me thinking about hell and how miserable that must be. At least for that guy, it was going to end. He, within the story, it's not really telling you whether there's an afterlife or not. You just assume, okay, he just has to get through this and die, and then it'll all be over and it'll just be black.
Though on that note, what a terrible transition that would be to be burning alive in this life,
yes,
and then to be waking up in hell.
Yeah, and realizing that it's not ever going to end. I thought about that too, yeah. And so all that to be said, what is my tiger? My tiger is hell and the eternal conscious aspects of it.
Yeah.
There are certain things in Christianity that I really like being true and I feel really good about.
Yeah.
And there's other things that if I could be God, which is always a great way to start a sentence as a Christian, I would change them. And the eternal conscious nature of hell would be one of them. I am actively rooting when I listen to like a debate amongst Christians about hell, which I've done a few times. I root for the annihilationist people.
Sure.
I really want that to be right. That would make me feel so much better. But when I read the text, when I see how dire the warnings are, when I read Revelation, when I see what Jesus has to say on it, it seems like it's a very, very serious thing. And it's not as simple as people just being wiped away and not realizing what's going on.
And I think that it's worth noting that a lot of Christians have different views on hell.
Yes.
Right? That the annihilation approach. But that, that's something we can talk about in a later episode, why our interpretation of the text is such that hell is a place where there will be gnashing of teeth and not gnashing of annihilated nothingness. Quoting Jesus, whatever, no big deal. Jesus said it, but it could be wrong, I guess. But for the purposes of this episode, I just, if you're out there and you're listening and you're gnashing your teeth because you're like, that's not what hell is, it's just take a moment to acknowledge, sure, there are other opinions out there, but that, for Kevin here, this is what seems to bring you the most frustration. And in fact, you are heavily incentivized to find another interpretation.
Yes.
And to believe that other interpretation.
Please help me out there.
Right?
If you have anything, I'll look at it.
Yeah, if you're out there and you're like, this is so wrong for this many reasons, even though Jesus said it, it's open to interpretation. I get it. Quite literal, but it's okay. No, I'm not trying to toss shade. I would be interested to hear other arguments on that for real. But yeah, send him out Kevin's way and help him tackle that tiger, because I know it bothers him a lot. But Kevin, something that I know from our previous conversations is that it's not just the concept of the eternal torment. It's the knowledge that there are people that, people that you love, that as of this moment, that would be their final resting place. If they were to die right now, right? Present company included, right? That's something that I've always found really compelling from an anti-Christian perspective. Not that I'm anti-Christian, but if you were opposed to Christianity, I think that that's a really, really good counter-argument. You want to talk a little bit about how you have processed that reality, that knowledge that there are people you love, people that you know that will likely end up suffering forever?
Well, if I'm being completely honest, I just try to not think about it. That's my main strategy. And then, sure enough, I'll read the Bible or hear somebody talk about hell, and it'll come back up. One of my attempts that I've been trying lately is to try to realize, one, how perfect God is, and two, how wicked humans are. And so what I do when I'm looking at a loved one is I see a lot of myself in them. I see that we're pretty similar in a lot of ways. We live our lives in a similar way. We come from similar backgrounds. And so I can find them very relatable. However, I'm not looking at them from God's point of view, which is, what is it in Isaiah? It says our good deeds are like filthy rags to God. I mean, we're so disgusting. It's like if you dipped Adolf Hitler in a bunch of poop and then, sat down next to him, and I can't think, it's something so disgusting that we can't even comprehend how wretched and terrible we look to God, because we're comparing ourselves to each other. And because I have the sin nature still, I grade on a curve. I'm like, he's not that bad. We're pretty much similar, And so that's one way, is I just have to accept that I can never really comprehend just how evil we are in God's sight. Now, the counter to that is that ultimately God made people that way. He made those vessels of destruction, as they're referred to in Romans 9. He's ultimately the source of that. And I just have to accept that he wanted to make some things terribly ugly and other things beautiful. And I have to say, although I would never say this to their face, I don't even feel comfortable saying it with you sitting across from me. I would have to say that people who don't believe are those vessels of destruction. They're just ugly things that he made to display beauty. I don't like that that's how he did it. Frequently when I pray, and this has really helped my prayer life actually, I am just very honest with him and expressing my distaste for that and sometimes disgust for it, and how it's very hard for me to love him when he set up the world that way. Yeah. Not to say that I always feel that way. It's in, my darker moments, but it definitely comes to the surface. And I think ultimately I just have to accept that God is God and I'm not, and whether or not I like his system doesn't really change its reality. I do believe in its reality, and I'm not certain of it, as we said, but I do think it is reasonable, and it's the best thing I've found. And so I'm grateful. I believe God saved me. I'm pretty sure I'm saved. There's times even that I doubt that, but I just have to accept the system as it is and hope that he is as good as he says he is, and that it is working together for the good, and that this is the best possible way that things could be set up. But I really have reservations with it, and I completely understand people like yourself who are very troubled by it to the point of not wanting to have anything to do with it.
And I think that what's interesting is ever since leaving the faith, I feel like I've come more and more to terms with the logic behind it. It's still something that I find personally to be too egregious. But I do think that, and we were talking about this earlier, I do think that it's difficult for us to say what amount of bad is acceptable, given that our perception is so based in what's relative to us, right? We were discussing earlier the fact that most people, I do believe, enjoy some level of conflict in their life. And I'm sure there are other episodes where we have discussed this or will discuss this, but I really do believe it's what drives narratives, right? You don't want to watch a story where nothing sad happens or nothing bad happens or no challenges are met, right?
It's really boring.
Right. Some of the most famous films of all time are a testament to this, right? I mean, you think about Rocky, right? Rocky Balboa, the first Rocky movie where, spoiler, if you haven't seen this film that came out in, I think, 1978, 1977, 1976, I don't know, won an Oscar. He loses. And the entire movie is him struggling to be worthy of his opponent and to compete on an equal level with Apollo Creed, right? And we love the underdog story, right? I'm not going to say that's the original underdog story, but it's a very iconic underdog story.
Sure.
Where we get to see somebody who has no chance work his butt off
to some great theme music.
Yeah, to some
I
excellent,
love that music.
To some excellent music, with some scenes that don't age so well. We're not going to talk about those, but we love that. We love an underdog story. And how many times have you watched a sports match of some kind and known there's a clear favorite and been like, I really hope that this underdog pulls it out? You know, how often is it satisfying to see a 10-6 football team defeat the 13-3 number 1 seed? Right, and we're using the 16-game format because that's what it was for a very long time. Yeah. All right. Anyways, so we like challenge, we like conflict, and why do we like conflict? I think because, like you alluded to before in Romans 9, conflict creates the contrast that allows us to appreciate the good things, right? When you get a hug every day from your mom, it's just what we have. It's just what we get. You know what I mean? But when you go away to college, or when, you know, or when your mom passes, you know, that hug, it becomes a memory that's cemented forever. It's something you cherish.
Yeah, it becomes more valuable.
Something that you wish you'd cherished more frequently.
For sure. And
not to say that the trade-off is worth it.
Yeah.
But to say that there is beauty in that. And there is depth in the pain that we feel. Right? And I think that, you know, in recent years, some loved ones of mine have lost loved ones of theirs. And watching them go through that process has taught me to appreciate the time I have with my loved ones. And to know that time will one day run out. It deepens the love that I have for the people I have in my life. To know that I will one day lose them, right? And to see that loss firsthand. You know, I think that for so many people, the most defining moment in their life was their lowest point. Because they overcame it, or they didn't overcome it, you know? But it does seem like we need that knowledge. We need the knowledge. We need to know how low it can go so that we can appreciate the highs or even the mids for what they are. And, you know, this is the real major point that we had discussed earlier, is just what's bad is relative to what we can understand and what we can perceive, right? And I spoke with someone. I spoke with a friend of mine who had departed from the faith as well. Some might call her an ex-Christian. Some might say that doesn't exist. I'm not going to say who is who on that scenario, but let's just say they're in the room right now. We were discussing this, and she said, God didn't have to make the world this bad. So how do you know that it's this bad? Right? Could we live in a world where the worst possible thing in existence is theft? And if we did live in that world, would we say, God, how could you make a world where people steal stuff? That's horrible.
Right.
We'd be justified in thinking that because we only know what's relative to ourselves. And it's hard. I'm not trying to diminish the terrible, terrible things that happen in this world, but it's what we know relative to ourselves. And there could be, it could be true that just the structure of the physics and metaphysics of the universe require that certain things happen, and that in alternate universes, they're thinking, wow, they got it good. They got it easy, right?
Yeah.
And we would never know. We're limited to that. We're limited to that perspective. And even in our own world, I feel like there are different worlds. There's the United States, where a majority of us are not worried about where we're going to get our next meal.
Yeah.
And there are other countries where hunger is the primary issue, right? And we have no context for what it feels like to live in a world that's so primal, where food is not guaranteed. And you have to work and hunt and compete and commit crimes just to survive.
Yep.
That world is foreign to myself, right? And I just think that relativity really makes it difficult to say that God made this world too cruel. And so I think that those two ideas combined, the idea that we like conflict, the idea that conflict and challenge and suffering can create a contrast that makes life better, that makes the good things great, right? That those vessels made for destruction, make better known the riches of his glory, the riches of his mercy, right? I think we can accept that idea that we need that conflict, and we can combine that idea with the world that we live in and the conflict we experience relative to ourselves, right? And in that frame of reference, I think it becomes more difficult to be critical of God for just how terrible the world is. But I know that you've thought about that, and I'm curious if that brings you any solace, or if there's deeper layers of your misery here.
Yeah, it's easier to stomach when I say vessels of destruction. It's harder when I put a name down. Mm-hmm. Friends, family members, people who have died, who I'm pretty sure did not have a deathbed conversion. Yeah. That's a person. That's a soul that it was created just to show how beautiful God's mercy is. And it was like, well, we need this soul to suffer forever to show how great God is. Yeah. And maybe this is a critique of like modern Western Christianity, but that's not like the feeling I was supposed to have about God. Like that's not what I was told about God. And it feels like now that I've thought through a little bit more about it, it's kind of over the past years, it's just been kind of deflating a little bit. I thought I was just going to love God more and more, but I have to admit that this has been kind of a speed bump for me. I felt like I'm just going to fall more in love with God. I'm going to appreciate him even more there are certain things that I appreciate him more for, but this is one of those things that as I've thought more about it, it just makes me pretty upset. And I like to talk about, I call it the Pauline bargain. If you look, again, going back to Romans 9. If you haven't read that, by the way, read the chapter. Like,
just read the book.
You need to, read that.
Just read Romans.
If you only can read one chapter, Romans 9. In the beginning, Paul talks about how if he could, theoretically, he would go to hell so that all of his Jewish brothers and sisters would go to heaven. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, that's not on the table, but what he's trying to express is his anguish and how much he loves them and how much he'd be willing to do for them. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, I don't think I would take that deal if I was Paul.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, I
no
would go
way.
to heaven. Yeah, exactly. But my version of that is, what if I could make the choice between, okay, Kevin, you get to go to heaven, and then this person goes to hell, or you both get annihilated at death? I would easily choose the annihilation option. Again, God isn't asking me. I have to accept his system. He's God. I'm not.
Yeah.
I've been alive for just over 3 decades, so it's really none of my business. He's not going to ask me anytime soon. But that just, to me, I would really prefer that. I would feel much better about, God and the world. And I've actually, there is a guy who I'm friends with he grew up Jewish. He doesn't believe in an afterlife, which is interesting. I just figured if you believe in God, you have to believe in an afterlife. He just thinks, no, when you die, it's just lights out. And I was like, at first I would have kind of scoffed at that. But if that really was the case for everybody, I could live with that. I mean, I wouldn't live with it. I'd be dead. But I would be okay with that. Mm-hmm. But with this system, with hell being, as I understand it, eternal and conscious, it's really hard for me to understand why God had to make a system like that. I don't get it. And maybe I just have to leave it at that. I don't really know if I'll ever figure it out. And I ask him for help, and I make known my feelings about it. But beyond that, I don't know what I can do.
Well, and as we discussed on the previous episode, I think that there's a logic to it, to the balance of heaven and hell, right? Not to recap too much, but the contrast becomes infinitesimal, right? It grows infinitely smaller between the riches of his glory and the vessels for destruction, if hell is not eternal, right? After enough time passes, however much time someone spent in hell will eventually be an afterthought compared to the vastness of eternity. So I think it makes sense. I remember John Piper, I believe, paraphrasing Jonathan Edwards, two very great, intelligent Christian men. And Jonathan Edwards, I suppose, was talking about why hell makes sense. And it was just making a comparison between how we view an atrocity, right? We view a thing to be as terrible as the victim of it is good, right? If you kill a murderer, it's not good. You're not supposed to kill people, right? But,
There are a lot of jokes too about killing pedophiles.
Yeah, right.
Like to make jokes about that. Yeah, and we don't think it's in bad taste. Like, I get it.
Yeah, you got to kill someone,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But then, if you kill an infant, right? Or if you kill a charitable, loving, kind person, right? Or a sweet old grandma, right? Then we consider the greatness of that person's character to be a blemish on, just how terrible of a deed you committed. Mm-hmm. There's a huge, huge, huge difference between killing a murderer and killing your own mother who loved and raised you, right? Mm-hmm. If that is the case, then that means that the offense of sinning against God, who is infinitely perfect and infinitely worthy, right, is punishable by infinite suffering, right? You're sinning against the greatest possible being ever. You're sinning against the God who sent his only son to die on the cross for your sins and lived a perfect life and didn't deserve it, right? And therefore, you're committing a heinous act. And that kind of goes back when you said, like when you were referencing Isaiah, that the best of our deeds are just dirty rags to God, right? Because the bad things that we do are just that bad because of the person that we're hurting. So I've heard it explained a few ways. I think it doesn't take, there's only so many ways you can polish a turd, right? There's only so many ways you can artsy your way around it. But at the end of the day, it's still acknowledging that people you love and cared about, people that God put in your life for your benefit, are going to experience eternal suffering of the worst variety imaginable. Still difficult to swallow. Impossible for some people, right? But that's the logic that I've heard. And that's sort of the best reasoning I've been able to come to through my studies and meditations on the subject.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I was talking about earlier, just like I want to get a better grasp of how perfect God is and how wicked man is. I think part of it is I underestimate both. And like you said, I don't think I'll ever come away getting warm and fuzzies from that, but it will help me to understand it a little bit more. Something that I also think about that I think I might be stretching a little bit too far. I'm curious what you think about it, but there's the parable that Jesus tells about the rich man and Lazarus. And in this parable, there's a rich man in hell, and Lazarus was a beggar who was by his door. And it's interesting that the rich man suffering in hell in this parable, again, it's not Jesus saying this is what hell is like. He's just giving a parable. So, take that as you will. But
the rich man suffering in hell consciously in a non-annihilated way. Okay,
yeah,
I'm just curious.
Yeah, again, this is just a parable, so
just could be anything.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting to me that he doesn't say, "Get me out of here." He just says, "Can I have a drop of water? Can I have relief?" And I find that interesting. It's like it was almost merciful that he wasn't even imagining a world where he could get out. Like, to me, that would be worse, would be to be stuck there and know, I can get out of here. There's a way out. Somebody can rescue me. He's not even aware of that possibility. It's just, hey, give me a drop of water right now, And I wonder if, in the similar way that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hardens the hearts of those in hell. Because to me, one of the worst parts of hell would be to think that I don't have to be there. But if you could just almost be blind to the possibility of any other existence, not saying that hell's going to be enjoyable, but that might actually be a merciful thing. Do you think I'm going out on a limb too much there?
I think when you're talking about the worst possible thing happening to you every second for the rest of eternity, the fact that it could have been slightly worse, it doesn't sound like an act of mercy to me, personally. It's not something I would hang my hat on, personally. But now you go, wow, when you put it that way, God's actually really cool. It's pretty terrible to me. It doesn't soften the blow at all, I don't think. I just... Mike Tyson giving me 100% punch versus Mike Tyson giving me a 99.9% punch. It's still pretty bad. I don't want it.
Yeah. And there's also people who try to say, well, yeah, hell's a real place, but, it's not as bad as the imagery, which Piper actually makes an interesting point. He says, usually when there's images, it's describing something worse. It's more extreme than the image is trying to portray, not easier. So it might even be worse than a fire, But, okay, even if you do say that, it's not that bad. It's like, would you want to go there? If you had the choice between heaven and that, would you want to go to your mild version of hell? Even with annihilation, I mean, I guess this is debatable. Some people probably would be rather annihilated than, have eternity in heaven. I think you put a gun to my head, I'm going to pick eternity in heaven because I'm going to trust that God's going to satisfy me 100% all the time, even though it's hard to even imagine that being a possibility.
I'd want to hold on to my choice. I'd be like, let me try heaven for a bit.
Yeah. Like a 90-day
and if
free
I'm
trial.
not feeling it,
if you don't like heaven,
right,
you will be annihilated.
Give me a refund. You know what I mean? Just a 2-year warranty. I don't know, two millennia warranty, something like that. Yeah.
But, when I tried to throw out that thing about hell not being quite as bad, that's my attempt of trying to reconcile this God of love with this God of judgment. Like, see, he's not that bad, but
to reconcile the tiger with the lamb,
right,
so to speak.
Mm-hmm. But I think you just have to hold them in tension, and also you have to realize that it's not about you and it's not about me. It's about God. And that kind of hurts. I think that, again, in American Christianity, it has been very me-centric. God loves me. This is what
How
God
can
did
God
for me.
make your life better now?
Yeah, exactly.
Your best life now.
And
please don't sue me, Joel Osteen.
That's one of the things I appreciate for their faults about the Puritans, in the 1600s, was they knew how little they were. And it was just all about God's glory. Well, what's going to glorify God? If I have to get destroyed and it brings God glory, then I'm for that, Mm-hmm. I think in a very individualistic culture that we live in now, where we have a lot of self-esteem, that's kind of a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
To just realize, no, this is about God. And actually, he's justified in making it about him because he's the greatest being in the universe. It feels weird to you and me because we're not the greatest being. When we try to act that way, it comes off as, very cringy. But God can be selfish. Actually, he should be selfish because he is the greatest. He would be dishonest if he weren't exalting himself more than anybody or anything else. That's another John Piper thing that I've heard. So that's another way that I kind of try to grapple with it. But, these are just my way of trying to wrestle with it. And I like what you said about how making it go from 100% tiger to 99.9% tiger, really, it's 0.1%,
Yeah.
All that grappling will get me. And I think it just comes down to what's the reality, whether I like it or not. I do believe it's the reality. And so I have to accept it. And it doesn't make me feel good, but I do believe it.
But and that's the essence of truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know it's cliche, truth hurts, but I don't think that whatever the truth is, I don't think that it conforms perfectly to my preferences or your preferences.
Yeah,
it can't. As a matter of fact, it can't.
Mm-hmm.
If it conformed to all of our preferences, it would be at odds with itself.
It'd be chaos.
Right?
Yeah.
So whatever the truth is, I do believe in that, and that's a thing that I have considered, and when I was a Christian I considered, right? Was whatever the truth is, I'm probably not going to be comfortable with all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to acknowledge that there are going to be things that I don't understand, that there are going to be things that I don't like about whatever it is that I believe.
Yeah.
Whatever that reality is. And that's why when I left the faith, it wasn't about, well, no, I don't like this, therefore I don't believe it. It's about, well, no, I don't like this, therefore I don't know that even if it is true, I want to abide by it, if that makes sense. But that is the pinnacle of truth right there. It's probably not something you're super comfortable with, which is why, and I know we've been kind of taking jabs at American Christianity today, but it is why I think a lot of the modern churches are missing the mark a little bit. Is they're in their eagerness to be as welcoming and open and populated of an environment as possible. They choose to emphasize the things that we like and are comfortable with. And even if they believe and espouse doctrine that we're not comfortable with, they don't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. They don't want to put it on the forefront. And I think that's something I want to do with this project, right? Is I want to talk about it, and I want Christians to engage with that. I really do, because I don't think I don't think that the modern Christian church is doing a great job of communicating the full truth